Yes, guys, and welcome to the 18th episode of Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. Hope you've been enjoying the series thus far. In this episode, we're going to speak about or switch focus towards the island of Jamaica. We're going to speak about what the British position was and how they wrestled for sovereignty of Jamaica with the other European superpowers, and also just delve and touch into maroon culture, and the heroes of the maroon movement, which was a resistance movement started off in the sort of 1600 stroke 1700s, which needs to be mentioned and is a source of national pride in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean respectively. Anyway, let's get into this. Let's start off. Some souls are never meant to be enslaved. During the first European colonies, there would be numerous slave revolts, runaways, African and indigenous, that would form in search of sovereignty that would map out self-autonomy independent of colonial powers. Right from the onset of Caribbean slavery in the 1500s, there would be massive rebellions morphing into pockets of all-out guerrilla warfare. Indigenous populations that had been forced into slavery and African slaves that would run away to the mountains as it would be put from a weakened position of reality, when if refrained and observed for over an equated view, managing to evade European control that would be deadly if encountered head to head, would have made strategic importance for a group to operate with impunity that they would require a border of separation. Therefore, enclaves of dense tropical mountainous terrain would shelter the predominantly African escaped slave as a sanctuary. European munitions would have eliminated meeting fire with fire in conventional warfare, and so the only way for a population to leapfrog the extinction zone would be to establish camp in locations that would be hard found to be intruded upon by the enemy. The Sierra Mountains of Jamaica were the only place that the forever residents might be best placed. To send search parties with the intention of apprehension would have proved foolhardy and potentially extremely costly, and significant casualties within what would appear in density not too dissimilar to rainforest jungle would have built the accumulation of a zero-sum game. So here we are, it's African slaves living out their lives in an island consigned to lifelong servitude, right? So you've got two options really. You can stay within the slave society, or you can choose to exclude yourself from that society and run away, as it was put. But there's either running away or there's running away and obviously creating a new society, which was attempted and we'll go into. But anyway, let's move on. If the island of Jamaica is set out as an example of resistance, Jamaica was at first held in claimancy of the Spanish crown. However, the Dutch would be next to launch a campaign for the spoils. Eventually, both powers would see declining authority vacuumed by an aggressive onslaught British offensive, motivated by promise of all land seizures to be awarded as medals of honour for those that contributed to the war effort, most from the role of leadership to advance the cause for monarchy and country. In a two-pronged, amphibious forward motion, the British war machine, now in top gear ascendancy, became colonial rulers of Jamaica and Hispaniola. So you could say, like, geopolitically, there was a changing of the guard. 1600s, you could say Spain was the premier sort of colonial nation. But then the Dutch and the British got involved, but the British overthrew the Spanish and overthrew the Dutch advances. And obviously they were motivated, a lot of the leadership of the British were motivated because they would have got the spoils of war. It would have potentially been their families that would have been the ones that would have had the plantations and obviously bared fruit from Jamaica, and obviously all of its slave population and what it was churning in the sugarcane mills. So it was Europeans fighting for supremacy in the Caribbean that obviously had an effect on the slaves on which way they go. Because like Jamaicans could be speaking Spanish by all accounts. They could be speaking Dutch, but they ended up speaking British, clear as day British, even though they got a Jamaican dialect and patois. It is an English-based language, you know. But anyway, let's move on. So into the 17th and 18th centuries, the enslaved population began a series of spirited resistance insurgencies inhaled from the bowels of the Akan, descendants of modern-day Ghanaians, that would see the barefoot Kojo, leader of the Leeward Maroons, eventually clash in conflict against who would have been visualised as the dirty enemy. On the eastern side of the island, uprisings were also rolling thunder, gathered in force by Queen Nanny, not to be confused with the common Ghanaian name of Nana, but coincidentally very similar, and must illustrate high gambling odds of being a first-generation Ghanaian Jamaican whose veins were coursing the blood of Dankwa. She was equally as fearsome in leadership as the Jamaican national hero Kojo. In between an honourable mention of a third leader who fell foul of the panoramic maroon objectives was another Jamaican national hero known as Taki. Repetitiously, Taki, identical in namesake to Ben Taki, a world-class boxer of Ghanaian descent, is another connecting link that recites the theory that tribal togetherness was agonisingly close to catching fire of not only the cane fields but also the souls of the oppressors. There are two maroon wars in the bush of the tropics that have been noted where an unruly group of Africans that managed to relieve themselves of ball and chain had been labelled troublesome by slave masters who had to report losses that would be registered by central powers at the heart of the colonial empires. The loose term for mean runaways is where the name maroon derived. Over time, the word maroon would become culturally overstood as a title of the bravest order. The Maroons viciously fought for establishment with the Spanish, eventually having to concede a concession to an African movement that would not be denied the trappings of freedom. Pen was put to paper, ratifying Maroons were to coexist on a small island in their own fit-for-purpose built self-autonomous regions. Conditions of cordial conduct would have been outlined as to not entice an oversubscription of recent plantation slaves. In return for non-encroachment, both societies would coexist, although it must be said that some escapees would be returned to owners. However, the upside, they would inaugurate a self-administered probation scheme whereby a new stranger to freehold land space would be made to prospect for acceptance. Stronger than the immigration systems of today would have been the order of the day, as wayward acceptance could have harboured disingenuous new society members that would have fed sequences of destabilisation back to slave masters for ulterior reasons of plenty. So there we have it, 17th century, three prominent individuals that stand out. You've got Queen Nanny, you've got Kojo, and you've got Taki. Queen Nanny is very similar to Nana. Taki is a Ghanaian name, and Kojo is a Ghanaian name. And I wrote down the first Ghanaian Jamaican, but really, that was a Ghanaian that set foot in Jamaica and ran rampant. The Ghanaian community were in Jamaica. These are your people. Those were your citizens. Those were your brothers and sisters. At the end of the day, Kojo, as I'm pretty sure, is Monday in Ghanaian. So unequivocally, undeniably, the man has to be of Ghanaian descent, who is the national hero. So that's also a Ghanaian national hero. He's also your hero, because he was taken from your land and he set foot in Jamaica and he took it to the oppressors. Him and his small bunch, and they managed to carve out a sovereignty against what would have been a superpower, which would have been America of today or Russia or China of today. And just him and a handful of a few faithful followers managed to create the Maroon Society, which is something in a time where every other black person in the Americas was a slave. And it's something to be proud of on the Jamaican side, but also specifically West Africa, but more importantly, Ghana. That is proof your ancestors were in Jamaica fighting for their lives, fighting for existence, fighting for their rights. And it's something that links up both sides of the ocean, and it's something you should definitely be proud of, you know, because that's your hero, every much as it is a Jamaican's hero. You know, a Ghanaian, barefoot Ghanaian took it to the oppressors, you know, and stood firm and got something out of it, you know, because at the end of the day, they had the Spanish there. The Spanish couldn't hold it. The Dutch tried to come in. There was some type of natural disaster, I believe, like an earthquake or something. And so it eludes me now, but Jamaica had another capital that may have had a Dutch name, and it's still there. And then it switched to sort of Kingston because of an earthquake and whatever else or something like that. And now it's Kingston of today, which sounds quite British, but it was sort of Dutch and Spanish. It might have been a Spanish name, actually. It was a capital beforehand. Don't know. Spanish town, probably, yeah, right? But yeah, there was a lot of fighting with the Europeans, but in between all of that, the Ghanaians running rampant. You're the troublemakers of the dancehall. You are the kings. You were there 300 years ago, confirmed, taking it to the British oppressors or the European oppressors, and it's something that every Ghanaian especially should be proud of, because at the end of the day, if it means Monday, there's 1 in 7 Ghanaian men. Kojo is you. He is you. You are him. That is you. You should look in the mirror and see that is yourself. 100%. He would have looked like one of you, because I see so many lookalikes of people. One of you would look exactly like Kojo. Definitely 100% pure Ghanaian beef in Jamaica. Right? Anyway, all good. Love, love, love. Anyway, let's move on. Yep, so that brings this episode to a conclusion. You know, I have no idea on curriculum in schools or anything like that, but at 12 or 13, 14 years of age, I would have loved to have known information like this, even if it never struck me as quite important. Just growing up, I would have liked to have known that and had that in conversation. So I think it's quite important that people of African descent on any side of the world should know that type of thing, you know. And the Jamaican or the Ghanaian national hero in Jamaica, known as Kojo, you know, should be held aloft, and he is right now and forever reigns supreme, right? But yeah, what he went through extensively, and what Queen Nanny as well went through, and Taki, who fell foul because like politically he wasn't aligned with the other two leaders, and you know, he was sort of hunted down and taken out by his own people as well. Yeah, which is another story altogether. But yeah, you had the Leeward Maroons, who were the Western Jamaican, sort of on the western side of the island, and then you had the Windward Maroons, headed up by Queen Nanny on the right-hand side of the island, who were equally as fearsome and fought for independence, respectively, yeah? And they managed to forge out small communities that are still there to this day, because I watched a YouTube video, and there's like a man from Ghana, he's a teacher in Ghana, and he flew to Jamaica and managed to see all the similarities, and managed to see that he couldn't believe his ancestor had tread foot, and was like, it was a proper certified Ghanaian man running rampant in Jamaica, you know. So the Ghana man, do you know what I mean? That is you, and you are them, and it's all about togetherness, yeah. And yeah, they almost turned over the British. They almost got it going, but they just couldn't take it a step further and rid them off of the island. The British munitions, you know, the Western weaponry they wouldn't have had. You know, they would have just had their bare feet and tools, yeah, cutlass and whatever else, yeah, but nothing else. They wouldn't have had weapons, guns and stuff like that. So, you know, it's a tactical retreat as opposed to running, because if they met the British head to head, you know, they would have weaponry that would surpass what they've got. So, retreating to the dense interior of the island where it's well tropical rainforest or whatever, creates a buffer zone, creates a safe haven for you to live. And pretty much up until whenever, Maroons were never slaves. They were never slaves. They were making the best out of a uncomfortable situation, being taken from their homeland, never to be seen again. But technically, they were never slaves. They stood up to the slave masters. And, stories like that, if they would have caught wildfire, you never know what could have happened across the Caribbean. So they would have it would have been kept quiet for obvious reasons. Yeah, because if too many slaves knew what was going on in Jamaica, which they wouldn't know what we know right now, there could have been uprisings. There were uprisings, but they could have been on a more significant scale. They could have really went on the rampage, But even some of the slaves as well, like I was reading in extracts, they would turn on the Maroons as well and hunt down the Maroons like Taki for the white slave masters. So we know what the kind of person they are, right? But what else was I going to say next? Just on my train of thought. Also as well, I sort of getting my own sort of feeling, opinion. Once they had their community set, there were rules, regulations, there was some type of societal order, is what I established in my mind and what I could envisage as I took my mind deep into what they would have been seeing and thinking to the best of my ability within my imagination, right? And you could see they obviously would take in as many as they could, but they had law that was put into constitution, which shows like a communication with the British that shows they're on governmental equivalency with them, yeah? But they had to hand back certain numbers of slaves that ran away. But I could tell, like, had you behaved correctly and, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if they would have been a strong individual or maybe added something towards the team, they would have stayed, no doubt. But if not, they would have had to go back to the slave master. So a little bit of a downside, but they had to like weigh up their options and just behave like a government within, surrounded by, like a superpower that had no end of power, in terms of weaponry, and could have really forced the situation upon them. But going into a dense rainforest, I've been to the Caribbean, it's not floodlit, when it's dark, and it's really dark, it is, and you're in the bush. So no doubt it would have been scary times for any British person to follow someone in there. It would have been definitely a dangerous occupation, so that offered a protection for them. But then obviously they were there they protected themselves, and they held up their little pieces of land that they've got that are still there to this day. But yeah, ultimately the Maroons were never slaves. Certain Jamaicans were never slaves from the 1700s and fought, and it may or may not have been the best existence. Who knows? Who knows, You know what I mean? They lived a life of freedom to the best that they could. There's lots of food, fruits growing off the trees. As long as you've got a little bit of livestock or whatever else, you're living nice. You're living nice. You're living how you were living in Africa, probably, So, anyway, that brings this episode to its conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed it. I have. It's given me a source of pride as a Caribbean, as a West Indian person of origin. And I hope it has you too. And out to all the schools that are out there, this is something that you should be covering in the curriculum, I feel. It doesn't go to, especially like in a sort of black area or Caribbean area, African, whatever. English doesn't matter. I just think it's something worth going across. And I'm hoping you probably do. I'm guessing you probably do, right? So I could be wrong. Anyway, deliver this message straight to your heart because it's from mine. All right, love, bless, love, one.